So, I've come and gone from the Creation Museum, and obviously I didn't catch on fire. Yeah, that was one hell of a trip. One hell of a trip indeed. This video is probably going to be pretty long. First of all, I did see PZ Myers there. However, there was kind of a big crowd around him. I didn't even get to shake his hand or anything, and this was just when we were right outside the museum. So everybody kind of congregated early, and I assume just stuck with him throughout the entire museum, and I didn't even get a picture with him. However, there's a video that you should watch. I believe it's just called PZ Myers Eats a Frackin' Cracker, and he took everyone out at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon out into the little courtyard of the Creation Museum, and they had Eucharist, which was just a Triscuit with cheese whiz on top. I'm sad that I missed that. Anyway, onto the Creation Museum, and the first thing you see is a giant animatronic dinosaur right next to an animatronic person. You know, because they lived at the same time and all. And I have to admit, the animatronics are pretty damn good. I guess, you know, if you have $3 billion or $3 million or whatever going into your asinine project, you should at least do it well. They kind of milled us into the Grand Canyon. And each plaque that they had up presented you with questions. I can't remember any of them specifically, but they would present evidence, so to say, and then they would present you with like 3 questions per plaque. And so I was like, alright, cool, you know, we're gonna see some sort of scientific research, even if it is Answers in Genesis bullshit. At least they're presenting some sort of evidence. Not a fucking thing. The only evidence that they presented throughout the entire museum, and I hate to give away spoilers, is this. Things are the way that they are. God did it. Let that sink in, because that's the only answer from Answers in Genesis. So after we were told that the Grand Canyon was carved out in a matter of days by Noah's flood, we were told that there was going to be a speaker. His name was Jason Lisle, but his last name is spelled L-I-S-L-E, if you want to look him up. I absolutely refuse to call the man doctor, because he obviously doesn't deserve it. When his presentation started, I have to say I was incredibly impressed with the things that he put up on the PowerPoint, and I had some hope. He listed 5 of the top logical fallacies used by both creationists and people who believe in evolution. That's awesome. I can't remember all 5 of them, but the ones that stuck out in my mind were arguments for majority or authority, which are, well, the majority believes it, therefore it must be true, or the argument for authority, which is Dr. So-and-so did a paper on it, therefore it must be true. There's circular reasoning, which is air is breathable because it's air. And then the third one, rhetoric, which is appealing to the emotions of the audience when you give speculative evidence. So this Jason Lisle, giving a presentation from the creationist point of view that was entitled The Ultimate Proof of Creationism. Alright, so he starts out with 5 logical fallacies. Off to a good start, I'd say. Then he goes on to say something to the effect of, well, neither side has very good evidence, but we're going to analyze both of them, and he's going to obviously give us the biased side for creationism. Okay? That almost sounds plausible if it weren't for the fact that he was arguing for creationism. So like I said, he gave us 5 examples of logical fallacies. And the reason I gave you those 3 are because those are the ones he used over and over and over again through an hour's worth of presentation. I don't know how many times I heard the words, God's word is the ultimate authority because it's God's word. Not only is that circular reasoning, sir, that is an argument for authority. Another thing that I want to mention about Mr. Lisle is that he is an astrophysicist. Now, I just want you to let that really sink in. He is an astrophysicist. He works with the physics of space, and he is a creationist. Just give it a minute. Let's sit here together and just think about that. Now, Mr. Lyle had to go through school, I'm sure, to get his PhD. If he's a creationist, and he obviously doesn't believe in anything scientific, how did that man get through school? How did he write his doctorate? How did he write his master's thesis? How did he do anything but fail completely? At the very least, Mr. Lyle would have had to put his beliefs aside simply to pass. Get a passing grade. And I think that's pathetic and cowardly. The second thing about this presentation that I get especially up in arms about was his argument for morality. Morality is whatever brings the most happiness to the most people. But, in Mr. Lyle's view, it's not at all. In fact, according to Mr. Lyle, the evolutionists don't have a leg to stand on if they're talking about morality, because they have to borrow a presupposition from Christians. Now, I don't know how exactly this works. He had a bunch of diagrams, and they were all cute and all. One of them involved dynamite. Mostly they didn't make sense at all. What I believe he was basically saying was that you have God's Word as the foundation for your arguments. God's Word is the absolute truth. Gives you also your morality, and then there's two other things that I can't remember, but they're not really important for what I'm talking about anyway. So, since you have God's Word, and if you believe in God's Word, then you also have morality. But me, being a person who believes in evolution, doesn't have God's Word, and I just have morality. Therefore, I have to borrow from Christian fucking bullshit just so I can believe in morality. I don't really get how this works. His argument made no sense. He definitely was one of those people that runs you around in circles so you forget what you're thinking about 3 times, and then he gets to a conclusion and you don't even remember what he was talking about in the first place. Pretty famous tactic that creationists use when they debate. I don't go around killing people because if I go do that, it actually brings a lot of sadness to a lot of people. Therefore, it doesn't make sense to apply it to everyday life, or life in general. The thing that scares me most about Christians is that if they didn't have the fear of God in them, who knows what they would do. Even Mr. Lyle was up there at his podium saying, "There's a lot of things that I'd like to do to people, but I don't because God tells me that it's wrong." Well, what the fuck are you talking about? After this ridiculous speech, we continued throughout the museum, and it was logical fallacy after logical fallacy. Everything was explained with the reasoning, well, God did it. And there was no explanation whatsoever. The thing that I found the most inexplicable, and if somebody can explain this theory to me, I'd really like to hear it, it was the floating forest. But from what I understand, this is what it is. Before Noah's flood, or after Noah's flood, I don't think it really fucking matters because Noah's flood didn't exist. Anyway, in one of those periods of time, there was a literal forest that had no soil or ground to stand on, and it was floating on the top of water. Apparently, they found fossil record of hollow trees. I've never even heard of this, but I don't know, maybe I'm missing something. So they found fossil record of floating trees that had sunk to the bottom of this river or lake, or I don't even know where they found these. They didn't even say, really. And the best theory that they could come up with after finding evidence of hollow trees was a floating forest.